Let us pray. O Lord, we joyfully welcome back to Earth astronauts Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert, who, by your grace, their skill, and the skill of many men, survived the dangers encountered in their mission and returned to us safe and whole. We offer our humble thanksgiving for this successful recovery. Amen.
At long last, the happy ending, and the world seemed to pause for a moment to heave a global sigh of relief. The men of Apollo 13 had returned to Earth safe and sound. The simple but eloquent prayer offered by Navy Chaplain Philip Gerald was echoed in millions of hearts and in dozens of different languages. And the Navy band played tribute to the gallant lifeboat, the lunar module Aquarius. Good evening. This is Frank Reynolds with ABC Science Editor Jules Bergman here at our space headquarters in New York. After 4 days of reporting one crisis after another on this nearly disastrous mission, it is very good to be able to talk about the near miracle of its safe return. I think you'll agree, Jules.
No question about it, Frank. The crisis that began at 10:07 p.m. Eastern Time Monday night captured all of us. It captured the nation. For 87 hours as the men of Apollo 13 raced the clock, hoping that critical systems would hold out over 270,000 miles of space, it was this all Americans lost track of anything else. The near tragedy of Apollo 13 nearly became the ultimate fear in manned spaceflight. A crew lost in space with no way to get back. But in the end, after 4 exhausting days, talented men, machines that had backups, and years of careful planning paid off.
The story of this most perilous space journey in history, the flight of Apollo 13, in a moment.
There are some things about orange flavor Tang just about everybody knows. It's the energy breakfast drink, has rich, natural taste, and even more vitamin C than orange juice. And, oh yes, obviously, Tang is easy to make. But very few people know that Tang also develops a sense of responsibility. Especially in the young. No one should leave in the morning without his vitamin C. Isn't it great when you can serve a breakfast drink that has so much nourishment and builds character? Fact is, Tang was chosen to go to the moon with the Apollo astronauts. Tang, as nourishing here on Earth as in outer space.
They're alive and well. They have shaved and showered. 9 doctors have examined them aboard the recovery carrier Iwo Jima, which now is headed for American Samoa. The harrowing flight of Apollo 13 is over. The father of astronaut Jack Swigert perhaps best expressed it for all of us. He said, "The flight of Apollo 13 had a wonderful beginning and a beautiful ending, but I wouldn't give you 2 hoots for anything that happened in between." And that is how the most ambitious space mission yet will be remembered. Jules, let's start from the beginning.
Frank, Apollo 13 would have made all the scientists extremely happy. The goal of this 3rd lunar mission was expressed in the Latin motto on the flight patch, Ex Luna Scientia, from the moon, knowledge. Apollo 13 was to have landed in a hilly highland area called Frau Maro, not in one of the easier mare sites like those of Apollo 11 and 12. Lovell and Hayes would have walked on the moon twice for as much as 5 hours each trip, with the expectation of the best television pictures from the moon yet in color. During their 33-hour stay, they would have put out a sophisticated scientific package and perhaps have discovered just how old the moon was by drilling 10 feet into the moon in the key heat flow experiment. It was an ambitious flight and lunar exploration plan with many live television transmissions and some important photography experiments. It even included a new maneuver to save fuel for the descent to the moon. But the closest Apollo 13 got to the moon came, unfortunately, Tuesday night in the swing around to get our astronauts headed home. Some things were learned from Apollo 13, Frank, but not what was hoped for.
Well, of course, one of the things that we learned from Apollo 13 is that measles can be stronger than machines, almost. And another thing we learned is that the system of backup crews works. The original crew, of course, was quite competent. Commander Jim Lovell was making his 4th trip into space, his 2nd to the moon, and he had announced that it would be his last. The man who would walk on the moon with Lovell, Fred Hayes, a civilian, former test pilot, the man who was to have drilled 10 feet deep into the moon. And there was the first bachelor to go into space, Ken Mattingly, like Hayes, a space rookie. He was supposed to be the command module pilot, the one to bring them close to the moon and wait to bring them back after their lunar exploration. But Ken Mattingly had no apparent immunity to the German measles, to which they all had been exposed. And only now does his mother's statement to us before the flight seem prophetic. She said, when things have looked blackest for Ken, they have turned out for the best. Mattingly himself told Dr. Berry, the astronaut chief physician, if I were a black box, an instrument, you'd have replaced me sooner. But it was not until the day before the launch that the final decision was made. Swigert would fly for Mattingly. One rookie for another, one bachelor for another, one measles immune astronaut for one who was not. So it was Swigert, the man who wrote the command module malfunction book, who was in the center couch, adjusted to his somewhat bigger frame, when we were sitting here last Saturday at launch time.
We were at the Cape, Frank, and as you'll recall, the weather turned fine after a day of gloomy predictions. Between measles, helium tanks that seemed to be acting up, and the weather, the launch had seemed in doubt right up to Saturday morning. But the forecast actually turned out better than expected. The countdown went perfectly, and Apollo 13 looked as if it would cast off the threats of its being jinxed.
T-minus 25 seconds and counting, and Apollo 13 is go. T-minus 20 seconds, T-minus 20 seconds and counting. 17, guidance release. 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. Ignition sequence has started. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit and we have liftoff at 2:13. The Saturn V building up to 7.6 million pounds of thrust, and it has cleared the tower.
This is Mission Control Houston. We appear to have a good first stage at this point. Flight Dynamics Officer says the trajectory looks good. We show a 1/2 mile in altitude at this time.
13 Houston, go at 30 seconds. Roll complete and we're pitching. Roger that. Stand by for mode 1 Bravo.
This was the crew's first look into the lunar module, LEM number 7, named Aquarius. It would be their lifeboat, but no one knew that at this time.
Miles beyond Earth.
We're looking at the LEM's reaction control thrusters.
Okay, 13, that's a pretty good picture there.
ADR is verifying the docking wedge. Now.
Roger.
Okay, we're about ready to pull the LEM out, Joe.
Okay, 13.
There she comes. Okay, it looks like we're clear, Joe.
Okay, looks good. It's weird because we get the TV about 10 seconds after you call it.
Okay, I can see the S4B now out the hatch window, and it's.
Oh, that's very nice. Very nice.
Well, that was just about the last time until splashdown that anything on the flight of Apollo 13 would be very nice. The trouble started at 9:45 p.m. Monday night Eastern Time with this rather calm-sounding communication from Commander Jim Lovell. His words, "Houston, we've got a problem." Listen to that message as we look back at the men in mission control at that time.
had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Yes. Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main B bus undervolt.
Okay, stand by, 13. We're looking at it.
Okay, right now, Houston, the voltage is looking good. And we hit a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there.
And in the control center, Frank, as we all too well recall, the crisis was fully underway. Chris Kraft, the flight directors, Milt Windler, Glenn Lunny, all trying to solve the problem. Dr. Bob Gilruth on the right, the director of the Manned Spacecraft Center, Kraft on his left. Worried men, worrying to see if they had enough backup systems left with Jim McDivitt there to outwit the problems of the service module that had exploded and nearly taken the lives of Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert. The conclusion was that they could do it, but only by using the LEM as a lifeboat. There's Ken Mattingly, the man who almost made the flight, who the measles took out.
Things were still quite tense, of course. We did not know just how rough it was going to be. But at the change of shift briefing, Flight Controller Glenn Lunny answered a direct question with a direct answer. And then we knew.
How critical is this situation right now, in your opinion?
Well, I think it is as critical, perhaps probably the most critical situation we've faced so far in the manned spaceflight program in flight. We are about 70 hours from home, and we think we have the situation in control. We've projected the consumables as I've described, and we have a plan for carrying out the rest of the mission, but there's going to be no relaxation at all as far as that goes from now until splash.
And then, Jules, began the time that Jack Swigert's father said he wouldn't give you two hoots for. Recall for us now just what Mission Control did and what were those critical, life-saving maneuvers that brought us to this afternoon's happy ending.
Right. Well, the first of the critical maneuvers began on Tuesday. This was the attitude of the LEM here, Aquarius, and Odyssey, the command module, and the service module, in which the liquid oxygen tank number 2 exploded. The first problem was to stop the whole assembly from arcing out too far beyond the moon. As you recall, in one of the first mid-course maneuvers, they had done what was called a hybrid burn to produce better lunar lighting over the landing site for Almara, which they were once intended to go to. Well, that hybrid burn would have carried them far out or beyond the moon, so far that the oxygen supplies would never have lasted to get them back to Earth. The first crisis was to do a burn of this descent propulsion system engine to round out their orbit to return them to a free return trajectory, as it's called. There really is no such thing fully. A free return trajectory to get them back in the area of the Earth. That burn, the DIPS engine, the descent propulsion system engine, did perfectly. The next problem, solved only yesterday, was a second burn of this DIPS engine. Never before had it burned and carried the whole assembly with this much weight into a new orbit. But on the free return trajectory they were headed on to, the LEM, the command module, and the service propulsion system would have overshot the Earth. Its approach was too shallow. The whole assembly would have arced some 98 miles over the Earth and clean missed re-entering. The DIPS burn yesterday, a mid-course maneuver, steepened the approach and ensured that they would get down in the South Pacific. No one had ever tried it before, and it worked.
And even while the crew of Apollo 13 was fighting through space with their crippled spacecraft, they proved again just how great the human spirit can be. Here are some of the moments of lightness, if not humor, during those long hours. This extract may not compare to Pete Conrad's giggling on the moon in Apollo 12, but it will do to show the spirit of this crew.
Just out of curiosity, y'all going to read out on what the cabin temp was up there?
Yeah, we're getting 45 to 46 degrees.
Yeah, now you see why we call it the refrigerator.
Would you like to have us play some guitar music to put you to sleep?
Oh, you know how to get that guy.
We'll even have a 12-string guitar for you, Jimbo.
Okay. Fido is really busy today.
Oh, he's having a ball.
It must be because we haven't made any wastewater to
stereo all week.
Okay, going back up into the refrigerator.
Hey, I thought it was the bedroom.
Well, it's got a new name now because it's about 30 degrees cooler.
We think we've got all the little surprises ironed out for you.
I hope so, because tomorrow's examination time.
Raj.
Ken, this is Jim.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate the work you've done, and Jack says it's going to be hard to beat his record about saving SMRCS fuel all the way there and back.
I can't do much about that. Some people will do anything to set a record.
Well, during the long coast home, the manner was thoroughly professional, but there was one great moment when sentiment from a man for a machine came through strong from space. Listen carefully to Jim Lovell as the lifeboat Aquarius was jettisoned this morning.
Farewell, Aquarius, and we thank you.
We'll have more on the flight of Apollo 13 after this message from Tang.
Surprise.
Oh, breakfast in bed. 49 days in a row. Honey, I'm only having a baby.
Easy. Now drink your Tang and eat all the energy you can get. Remember, it's got lots of vitamin C. You know, Tang went to the moon with the astronauts? Gee, I wonder what he'll be when he grows up.
With all this Tang, I know what she'll be.
An astronaut.
She.
An astronaut?
For spacemen and Earth families, Energy Tang.
Get used to it. This is the way coffee is going to look from now on. This is the coffee. It tastes the way coffee always should have tasted. The coffee. It doesn't care about all the old coffee ideas. It's the coffee. It's all by itself. Maxim freeze-dried coffee.
One by one, each crisis was met and overcome successfully. The supplies had held out, the service module and LEM jettisons had worked, but there was still one troubling question. Had the heat shield possibly been damaged by the explosion in the service module? If it had, a normal re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere might then have been impossible, right, Jules?
Right, and the spacecraft might actually have burned up coming back in, and until the very last moment, as Pete Conrad and Frank Borman told us this morning, they too were worried that the heat shield might have been damaged. But in the end, as Odyssey proved when it did re-enter, the heat shield was in perfect condition. And Odyssey soared back into the atmosphere from its lunar re-entry just as Apollo 8, 10, 11, and 12 had.
And then eventually, of course, this morning came that great moment, the moment that we always wait for at the end of a space flight, any space flight. And there it is, the first sight of the spacecraft floating down through the clouds.
The one unjinxed element of this flight, in addition to their survival. Beautiful pictures, the parachutes opening. We saw it there for a second at 10,000 feet, descending into a slight cloud cover over the South Pacific, but a spectacularly clear day after earlier threats of bad weather.
Yes, the weather turned out to be just perfect.
And a mill pond sea, calm as could be.
There's the splash. We've never had such a close view of a splashdown before, and of the space capsule after it was down in the sea.
A uniquely close view with a live color television camera aboard one of the prime rescue helicopters that brought us in so close we could see the hatch being opened and see the astronauts' faces as they got out. That, of course, had been planned long before we knew Apollo 13 would become quite so spectacular a flight. The choppers were there orbiting the area even before Odyssey landed, practically on the money just 4 miles away. Seared by its experience as it re-entered.
Not too much bobbing about, though. And they landed right side up.
Right. In a stable 1 condition. Seared, but nevertheless in excellent condition. There's the first swimmer jumping out of 405, the prime recovery helicopter, and making good speed up to the side of the spacecraft.
It sometimes seems that this is the longest wait of all before they can finally get the astronauts out of the capsule.
Right, but in this case, they were lucky. The sea was relatively calm, the capsule wasn't bobbing about, and they spent only a little more than 35 minutes inside Odyssey. It must have been their first relaxed 35 minutes since late Monday night. There's the flotation collar around the spacecraft, the flotation balloons to upright it, had she gone over, opened, and the swimmers with the transfer life raft open. And then the hatch is open, with a swimmer there to help the first of the astronauts out.
Well, it did seem as though it took forever this morning, but actually the swimmers worked in very good order, didn't they? Very fast.
Very fast, very efficiently. First getting Fred Hayes out of the hatch, then Jack Swigert, and last, of course, the skipper of the ship, completely appropriate in this case, Navy Captain James Lovell. And even the transfer and the sling cage, as I call it, or the Billy Pugh basket, as the Navy calls it, after the sailor who invented it, was done very rapidly.
As each astronaut came in, the pilot, of course, verified his condition, said he's in excellent shape. And after Lovell had been brought aboard and all three were secure aboard the helicopter, they began their last airborne trip for today, heading for the deck of the carrier. It's a good shot from the hangar deck here.
Right. And the tone of the pilots' voices, as they said, he's in great shape, he's good shape, sort of made you feel like they expected to pick up icicles or men with pneumonia after those 3 days in a cold spacecraft.
At Mission Control in Houston, all eyes were on their large screen as they watched the chopper set down on the deck of the Iwo Jima.
Helicopter 66, by now a veteran of 4 Apollo pickups in the South Pacific. Seamen scrambling to get a ramp up, red carpet out, and there they come. First Fred Hayes, then Jack Swigert, and finally Jim Lovell. All in good shape.
They didn't waste any time. They moved right on down to the sick bay after the prayer there by the chaplain. We'll have more on the flight of Apollo 13 after this message from Tang.
Get used to it. This is the way coffee is going to look from now on. This is the coffee. It tastes the way coffee always should have tasted. The coffee. It doesn't care about all the old coffee ideas. It's the coffee. It's all by itself. Maxim freeze-dried coffee.
This is a typical meal served to astronauts aboard Apollo space flights. Oatmeal, sausage, toast, applesauce, and in a special zero-gravity pouch, Tang, the energy breakfast drink. Orange-flavored Tang with rich, natural flavor and more vitamin C than orange juice. Energy Tang for spacemen and Earth families.
President Nixon has proclaimed Sunday as a national day of thanksgiving and prayer. He said today was the most exciting day of his life, even surpassing the thrill of being elected president. He telephoned the families of the astronauts to tell them how proud he was of the men and of the families behind them. Then he had a few words of pride to express to the nation.
There are no adjectives that can be added at this time. I will only put it in quite personal terms. I thought that the most exciting day of my life was the day I was elected President of the United States. And then I thought perhaps next to that was the day that Apollo 11 completed its flight, and I met it when it came down in the sea in the Pacific. But there's no question in my mind that for me personally, this is the most exciting, the most meaningful day that I've ever experienced. I feel that what these men have done has been a great inspiration to all of us. I think also what the men on the ground have done is an inspiration to us. How men react in adversity determines their true greatness. And these men have demonstrated that the American character is sound and strong and capable of taking a very difficult situation and turning it into really a very successful venture.
Then the president announced his plans for tomorrow. First, he'll fly to Houston, where he will present the Medal of Freedom to the ground crew of Apollo 13, to the men who, as he put it, made the very difficult decisions on the spot. That ceremony will be carried live over these ABC stations when it takes place about noon tomorrow, Eastern Time. Then President Nixon will go with the wives of Jim Lovell and Fred Haise and will fly with them to Hawaii to say welcome home to the astronauts in person. There will be another ceremony there and a presentation of the Medal of Freedom to the astronauts. That ceremony, too, from Hawaii, will be carried live by ABC at about 9:30 p.m. tomorrow, Eastern Time. Jules?
The triumph of Apollo 13 is a triumph of men and backup machines over men and defective machinery. It is almost as if Apollo 13 should have been one of those tough proving flights that were expected to fail before we achieved the impossible and got to the moon on Apollo 11. Apollo 13 was the unexpected failure that replaced sure success. What does Apollo 13 mean? It tells us, for those who doubted it, that spaceflight is always going to be dangerous and require elaborate backups to prevent tragedy. A space agency investigating board now starts to find out exactly what caused that liquid oxygen tank to explode and to take the steps needed to be sure it doesn't happen again on future flights. Apollo 14, the next landing mission, had been scheduled for October 1st. But tonight, space agency officials indicate a delay. No one is sure how long it'll be is likely. In the end, Apollo 13 was a triumph because it proved that men can face and conquer failure, something that doesn't happen often anymore. Frank?
In Mexico and Spain, bullfights were canceled today, and earlier this week, a dozen countries, including the Soviet Union, offered ships to join in a recovery effort. One of those nations was Uruguay, whose navy consists of 3 ships, but the Uruguayans said we could have them all if we needed them. In Rome, the Pope prayed, for which we are grateful, and in South Africa, a witch doctor did the same thing, and we're grateful for that, too. The astronauts' adventure this week produced a sort of worldwide togetherness, a temporary byproduct of Apollo 13, but perhaps one that might even be more important than the moon rocks the astronauts did not bring back. This is Frank Reynolds with Jules Bergman at ABC Space Headquarters in New York, and good night.
The flight of Apollo 13, an ABC News special report, has been brought to you by Tang, the energy breakfast drink with more vitamin C than orange juice for spacemen and Earth families.